welcome to the Freedom Podcast. We are here with Becky Poole. Becky from Rotterdam, how are you?
Hello, everyone. I'm good, thank you. How exciting is this?
Yes, it's great to have you on, Becky. And I say from Rotterdam, but you've really come via Great Britain, haven't you? And
Very
uh,
true.
and so we'll get to that later on. But you're currently living in Rotterdam, pastoring our church there along with Greg. Tell us a little bit about what life is like in Rotterdam.
Wow, how do I capture Rotterdam? Well, first of all, for all of the Dutch listening, the people from the Netherlands listening, I actually live in a place called Capella aan de IJssel, which is like a little dorp just on the outside, or a little village just on the outside of Rotterdam. And they're very particular about that because I don't live right in
Yes,
the
but it's
city
not
centre.
officially Rotterdam.
Not officially, but the church is right in the middle of Rotterdam, so that's really cool. But it's great. I mean, it's very organized here. Like it's particularly bikes. If you ride a bike, you go everywhere on your bike here. This, in my opinion, is the best time of year because it's spring, and
Mm.
so all the tulips are out right now. It's really pretty. It's a very cool city, very urban city. Yeah.
Becky, did you ever think that you would be living in the Netherlands when, if you wind back 10 years ago, did you ever think that you'd be here?
No. No, not at all. Well, what
It's
is funny is
crazy, isn't it, where God takes you in your life?
I know if you do, I think my question when somebody said, "Oh, we're going to the Netherlands," I think you just automatically think Amsterdam. And when they were like Rotterdam, I was like, "Oh, great, where's that?" Like, great. I only know it from the song, like everybody
I
else.
also know from the song,
I'm not
yes.
going to sing it, but you know the one. But I think what's funny
Rotterdam
is
is anywhere but Rome. I don't
anywhere
know.
for Rome or Rome. Um, but yeah, what's really funny is when I look back though, there you can see like God's little clues. So I'm like, okay, I really had no connection with here. But actually, I went traveling when I was about 19. And again, we'll probably talk a little bit about this, but actually, that's where I recommitted my life to Jesus. And the first place we came when we were traveling around Europe was the Netherlands. And
Wow.
I only came here because it was actually the cheapest place to fly to start my European adventure. And now looking back, you're like, that wasn't by mistake. That really wasn't by mistake. And then even Greg, so my husband used to be in the army, and he jumped here. He was in the parachute regiment. So when I say jump, he didn't just jump. He jumped out of planes. Doesn't just jump at random moments. He jumped out of a plane here in Arnhem for the memorial celebration. So again, we came back to the
Wow.
Netherlands for that. So you can see there were like moments. But the first time I came to have a look, knowing that we were going to move here, I cried. I was like, it's a concrete jungle. Are we going to live here? Like,
Oh,
yeah,
bless.
God grew my
Wow.
heart. Now I love it. Now I love it.
Okay, so let's wind back a bit then. And you just mentioned there about your salvation. So talk to us a little bit about life pre that then. What was life like before you came to Jesus? And what were you doing? Where were you living?
Okay, so I was thinking a little bit about this because you mentioned salvation before, and I actually did grow up Christian in the early day years, and I
Right.
remember being 5 and praying the salvation prayer. Like I do remember that. Shout out to an amazing pastor, Paul White,
Yeah.
who was pastor of my parents' church at the time, and then through many circumstances, we ended up not in church. Um, right around the time I went to senior school. And I definitely remember, even from a young age, really knowing I had a real relationship with Jesus. And even just before I went to high school, I guess we call it here in the Netherlands, age 11, so like that sort of high school phase, I chose to be baptized, even though we weren't at church, because I knew, I think that I knew Jesus. Like my faith never wavered, but my life was different. And I had no life or like particular example to know how to live my life as a Christian. I didn't have a church, I didn't have Christian friends. So yeah, between the age of around 11 and I'd say 19, I just had no connection to church at all. I just went to school, did my clubs. I went on to do dancing at um, university, and so that time was very extracurricular. I was doing all of the clubs, like all of
All
the
of the extra
dancing,
bits, yeah. Hmm.
all of the extras. So I just finished school, go to dance class, go to singing, go to whatever. And then I actually auditioned for drama school and didn't get in. I got lots of reserves and I didn't get a scholarship, so I couldn't go. So I ended up having this kind of rogue year where, yeah, my life wasn't in a great place at that point. But also, just around that time, I decided to go traveling. And when I was traveling, I wasn't having a bad time, I had a great time. But I honestly, I can't describe it. I've never experienced anything like it again. But I sat on a bench in Italy and met Jesus. I
Wow.
just sat on a bench in Italy, and I just remember really strongly sensing that God was there, and that it was like a knock on the door for me of like, hey, there's a different way to live your life. And so when the following year, when I moved to London to go to
Hold
drama
on, hold
school,
on. So let's just go back to Italy a moment. I
yeah,
imagine there's some circumstances here that you're building up to this moment that happens where you're sat on the bench, but I'm guessing life feels maybe a little bit aimless. You almost like you're kind of drifting a little bit. And do you start just speaking to God on that bench? Is that what happens? Or does he come to you and start prompting you? Just talk to us a little bit more about that moment.
yeah. I think I was having a really good time at that time. Like I was young, I was quite successful, really. Like at that point, I did have a place at drama school and was traveling. I'd had a fun year and lots of adventures. Um, but I think I was looking for my identity. It's like I
Right.
had all the things, but I didn't know who I was in the middle of all of that. But I can't say that I was specifically praying or asking God. I just literally sat on this bench and I just had this strong sense. And I've never heard an audible voice, but it really did feel like, are we going to talk? And there was just this sense for me that I wasn't on my own, that like I
Okay.
knew my faith. Like when I really dug down to it, I knew who I was and I knew I believed in Jesus. But there was a bit of time after that. Like I carried on traveling. I think it was about 6 or 7 months, and it was there I'd made a decision. But my life, to some degree, carried on for a good few months as it was. But I just had this kind of seed planted that when I get to London, I'm going to find a church. Like when I have my own home and my own place, I'm going to find my own church. So it was like very much this was then my life and my choice.
Amazing that those seeds that were planted from when you were younger are almost starting to bear fruit. And I imagine also the prayers that were prayed over you as a child, even maybe prayers from perhaps your parents or church members, it's almost like you can't escape those promises that have been spoken out over you. And amazing how they were chasing you down on a bench in Italy. It's quite an incredible thing. So you move back your year of travel is over, and then what happens next?
So I rock up in a place called Sidcup in Kent. I ended up going to a dance school called Bird College to study 2 years in. It was actually acting with musical theatre. So I was going to study there, and literally opposite the building was a New Frontiers Church. For those who know, church is like an organisation of churches. But the only reason it caught my attention is my mum and dad's first church was New Frontiers. So even just that detail that it was like familiar, I was like, oh
Yeah.
well, there's the church literally opposite the door. There was this big old steeple with this really kind of modern text on it saying New Frontiers. So I was like, oh, there it is. Um, so then I start going to this church, and that was quite an interesting year. I think I heard you talking about Pastor Gary about, we give our lives to Jesus and then it doesn't all suddenly work itself out.
Yeah.
And I had a little chuckle to myself because I was thinking, yeah, I really learnt that in that year because as I started to pursue God and started to really enjoy going to church and enjoying like a new community, it then started to challenge some things in my life. And I'm quite ashamed to say that at the end of that year, well, halfway through the year, I went to Soul Survivor, which is like, again, a big Christian kind of camp. For those who don't know, Soul Survivor is a big organization where they do lots of camping through the summer and lots of like youth would get
Yeah.
together. And so I went and volunteered for that. And I think for me, a real recommitment moment was there was a song, and I remember looking at the stage and the lyrics and just feeling like I wanted to live in this kind of environment forever. I was like, I wish I could live in Soul Survivor, like with all these other Christians. It just made a lot more sense and it almost made life easier rather than going back out there. But there was a lyric on the screen that was "Break my heart for what breaks yours,
Right.
everything I am for your kingdom's cause." And I think that for me was a definite moment that everything I am for like your kingdom's cause was definitely a moment where I was like, wow, am I like, how do you give your life? Like, what does that look like? Because I get being a Christian and going to church, but what does giving your life look like? That was a whole new concept to me. And so I remember really sobbing that day and just being like, okay, Lord,
Yeah.
like, I feel
I
like you're calling
remember doing that
something.
song. That song is Hosanna, and it's
Yeah, that was
it's
it.
yeah, by Hillsong. I think it's Hillsong United, and it's yeah, it's a powerful song, and those lyrics, they do really hit. But amazing how that was impacting you at that time.
It was a really cool moment. And I think we were talking about it at church a couple of weeks ago, like lyrics sometimes go beyond what words can.
Yeah,
And especially having been musical and really loving music, I just encourage anyone that maybe who's having trouble with their word, particularly like reading their word. I remember for me that was a real battle in the early days to like sit and engage with the Bible. I just found it really hard to understand, and that took some discipline and some walking. But for me, worship, it was where it all made sense. It kind of all came
right.
together in worship, and that really helped. Um, but yeah, so I remember making that kind of like commitment. But yeah, later that year, when some things started to get challenged in my life, I bolted. I was actually meant to turn up that Sunday. I was on the worship team by then. They'd really invested in me. I'd made a lot of really big changes, but something came up again that had been like a battle for me. And it came up again, and I just bolted. I basically knew I was moving from this college to Trinity College of Music across the city. And so after that Sunday, I just never went back. I just didn't turn up. And so I sent them a letter actually when I recommitted my life to freedom, because now if somebody did that here, I'd be heartbroken. And they must have wondered like what happened, because I never contacted them. I just left. So and then I started going to Hillsong because I really didn't want to be without Jesus. I knew that. I was like, I don't want to do this life not knowing Jesus. I couldn't bear it anymore. I was like, I know what it's like to not do life with Jesus, but I also can't quite work out how to do this thing, church, and I can't work out how to like work piece my life together with this or make the necessary
Yeah,
changes almost. And so
it's really
Hillsong was,
interesting. It's really interesting,
yeah,
Becky, what you're saying, because I think that there's something um, in us all that we're going through this transformation process. And you're right, we talked about this with Pastor G just a couple of weeks ago in the podcast. We talked about this process. Oh, I'm a Christian now, so my life is meant to be sorted, and somehow it hasn't yet fully come to life. I'm still changing and growing, and I think that perhaps we don't do enough sometimes as the church to ground people in that truth and say, it's okay, you're on a journey, and encourage them. Because I think that sometimes we get faced then with our own failure and we think, I haven't lived up to it. I'm embarrassed. I'm being challenged on something, perhaps. And it's like, I need to hit the escape button and get out of here. And I've seen some people leave over the years like that, and it is incredibly difficult and painful when people do just kind of disappear. Uh, but there's something about that, knowing that truth, that we're all on a journey, and that
yeah,
actually you need to have grace for others, but also grace with yourself as well. And it's not that we excuse sin or behavior, but it is having some understanding that we've got to try our best and we've got to keep repenting and coming back to Jesus. But there's forgiveness and grace there. And then we learn from it and change and grow through it.
yeah, yeah. It is. It's in a. I don't think that journey ever stops. I just think what's really helpful is when you look back, you do see little like milestone moments, and that
Mm.
really helps. And do you know what? I may not be living in the sin I was living in then, or making some of the poor choices I was making then, but we all still have a continuous battle. There's other things, if it wasn't
Yeah.
that, it's now this, because we're all imperfect. We're not like Jesus. And so yeah, I went to Hillsong after that, and Hillsong was fantastic. Like especially for the type of people in London, it was
Hmm.
meeting a lot of people in London because people are really busy, and like at least, I was getting in and connecting in with the word every week. Um, I was getting in and sort of connecting in with that word every week and getting to church every week, even if I wasn't like connecting in with a midweek group. I went pretty consistently actually. And yeah, that's where Greg enters the picture.
Come on, Gregory.
So Greg was a friend from school. Greg and I met when we were 16, and we went to like a sixth form college, which is age 16 to 18. Um, and we met there because we both come from separate towns where there wasn't courses. So we met there and we're just friends. But that year, I met, like I started connecting with Greg online and we started dating, and that was part of that journey. I knew that Greg at that point probably wasn't a good choice as someone to date. He wasn't a Christian at that point. um, but it wasn't particularly serious at that phase. We were just getting to know each other, but Greg was having a hard time and I wasn't sure where it was going, so I invited him to church because I did sort of think, well, if it doesn't work out, like, he's a good friend and I've known him a long time, like, I should really introduce him to church. But that took me places I didn't expect because Greg responded that Sunday. He isn't just like hands up. If anyone has met Pastor Greg, um, Greg is all in. Like, he's all or
Also,
nothing. So, so he's not just like hand in the air. He's like stood up, both hands sobbing. Like, he is like respond. I think if he could have crawled across the chairs to the front, he probably would have done. So he like
incredible.
responds, and then we go for coffee. Probably one of the most awkward coffees I've ever had. Like, I'm sat there like, oh my gosh, what have I done? What have I done? Because now this guy is like got all these thoughts and questions, and he just looked at me, and I'll never forget it. And he went, "But if you believe all of this, why are you living like this?" And I've never
Oh
been.
my gosh.
And I think I remember being like, well, it's been a journey. And then thinking, right, well, as soon as you leave, we're never going to speak again. And that was that. But actually, as he starts sharing, as he starts opening up, I realized, similar to my story, he had he really knew who Jesus was from a young age as well. You have to do another podcast with him and catch up on his story because that's an amazing story. Um, but yeah, from there we started dating and attending Hillsong, and we weren't really sure what to do. We were like, how do you do church individually? How do you do church as a couple, especially a
Yeah,
couple who
right.
don't really know what you're doing? And also, Greg was living in Wales, near Cardiff, just outside of Cardiff, based there with the army. And I was still living in London. So it would be like, I'd go to Hillsong every week, and maybe every 2-3 weeks he'd come along. So we were like not really sure how this was sustainable. And then Greg had to go back to Afghanistan with the army. And at the same time, I got my first professional job with a tour of the UK. So we both left London. I don't even know what year that was, 2010, 2009, I don't know. But anyway, we left London and I went off on tour. Greg went to Afghan, but we both said before he left, we're going to pray for a church that when you come back, like, there's a plan. Because, am I going to stay in London? Are you going to stay in Wales? And we need a church. And it was a strong sense at the time that I may move to Cardiff because it was cheaper. I was like, I can live in Cardiff and then I can commute to London. That's much easier. Um, so that was the plan. And then Greg met an amazing man in Afghanistan called Bob, and Bob was part of Freedom Church.
Hmm.
And Bob was like, "Hey, we're starting a church in Cardiff." And we were like, "Perfect." And even that again is a miraculous story because Greg's in Afghan. We've been praying about this, and then the lion card, the Freedom Lion, is on this wall, and it says Freedom Church. And Greg's like, "I'm looking for a church. That's perfect." He finds this guy and is like, "Tell me about your
Wow.
church."
How crazy is that? Is that this guy, and I remember this happening, and Bob was meeting with just a couple of people regularly that out there and just sharing with them about our church and about our vision. And there are thousands of soldiers on the base, aren't there, that you could
Yeah,
be crossing paths with or connecting with. But you happen to connect to this guy, Bob, because that's what God had ordained. That's what God had put in place. And it starts impacting him, doesn't it, while he's out there? And out of all the places, like, God meets him
yeah,
in Afghanistan. And it's
yeah,
like God's meeting you on a bench in Italy, and he's meeting Greg out on a base, on an army base in the Middle East. Just absolutely incredible.
And again, like we could probably do 5 podcasts because there's just multiple moments where like God put people in place just at different moments to like encourage. There were
Hmm.
prayers, there were books, there was, yeah, it was just mad, like the things that God's dropping in. And again, I think looking back, you're like, oh my goodness, how amazing is God? Like he's on our case in all these details. And so yeah, just to encourage anyone, like you're going to look back and you're going to see that God was in it all along. Because definitely
Yeah,
at the time, in myself at that time, all of this is happening, but life wasn't particularly easy. So Greg's away, I'm worried, is he coming back? At that point, where this young couple without a real direction, life has completely changed. So we were quite out there, quite nomadic, and I'd say quite vulnerable at that point. And God really just threw everything around us at that time. We definitely felt like, okay, God is with us. That was a strong sense of the time. I was like, this doesn't make sense and it's crazy, but I just feel like God is with us. And so, literally, the week after, again, there's a whole other testimony of health in there, but around that time, I wasn't very well either. And so, the Sunday we actually walk into Cardiff, um, we were so ready to be there because we'd heard about this church like months before. And I feel like that day was kind of when everything fell into place. You're like, oh, this is where we're meant to be. And home is the only way I can describe it. It was like, that was where we were meant to be at that time. And we just had to say yes. And we just had to get on board and help and be part of this family
do
at
you
that
remember
time.
what that first service was like? What was spoken, or what it was? What was your first impressions?
I don't remember what was spoken, but what I do remember is Pastor Gary and Heather were there. And because we don't know any different, we thought that was really normal. And so everyone was like, Pastor Gary and Heather are here. We're like, great, they seem really cool. And they came over and like prayed for us at the end. And we were really impacted by that because at that point we got a sense that these were like visitors for the day, like these were guests for the day and these were special guests. And that they took a moment to like pray with us was really amazing. And just to meet Bob myself, like I'd never met Bob. And what's really cool is Tom Cook, who is married to Sean Cook. They were the pastors here in Rotterdam when we planted Rotterdam. They were there that Sunday and they had been praying for us. So to meet them and then again see that story evolve to us coming to Rotterdam, yeah, it was a special. I just sobbed. I
Yeah.
think I just sobbed that entire service.
A lot of tears.
There were a lot of
Um,
tears.
so Becky, just through that period, then you're joining
Yeah,
Freedom Cardiff, and
yeah,
it feels like to me that your life really starts to almost become more uh, like the fruits of the spirit. You're actually living the Christian life. It's almost rather
yeah.
than just attending services now. Your life starting to change. You want to just talk to us a little bit about how it started to impact your life, plugging in to Freedom Church and into the community there in Cardiff.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, I think that, funnily enough, was probably one of the most challenging seasons. And I think that's important to say because as soon as you do say yes
Mm,
to God's call and it's that big, exciting moment, then you actually have to, get your boots on and get the work done. It's time to plug in and to get involved. And
yeah,
our life um, wasn't a picture of Jesus at that time in the sense of I'd still say we were drinking fairly heavily at the weekends. We weren't married. We weren't living together, but in no way were we setting our relationship up in a healthy way in those early days. I think we knew we were committed to each other at that point. But we didn't have a plan, and we didn't really know how do you date. Like we'd only ever dated non-Christians, so that was also a process. And it was just allowing a bunch of people to speak in. So there were at that time we were very blessed to have Pastor Dave and Saz were leading Cardiff, and they were really invested in us. Looking back, they were like a young family with their first child. Like Saz, I think, was about to expect her second, and so they were super busy. And looking back at the amount of time they invested in us and put up with us, we had a temper on us. We used to have these rows in their living room and they put up with us and had all the patience in the world. I don't think I would. But it was messy. We had to expose our messy and then deal with it.
wow,
Um, and that was a bunch of decisions and a bunch of difficult comments of like, hey, that is not okay behavior. Like we don't, that's not the way we behave towards each other. And hey, that may have been the past, but you have a choice now. And
Yeah.
so there were a bunch of conversations like that where sometimes for a couple of days I'd dig my heels in and then be like, okay, no, if I want to change, then I've got to hear these things and I've got to be okay that, yeah, my life isn't a great picture right now, but it can be. And that's not a smooth road. And just a huge honor to obviously Saz and Dave, but also Hannah and Ryan Salis became our group's leaders, Tracy and Martin, and also Tony and Paul, who are now the pastors in Cardiff. Hannah and Ryan are the pastors in Birmingham. Those incredible leaders, like, yeah, really put up with us. And I think what does help is we're not shy. We're not, we wear our heart on our sleeve. So I think that can help. Like we'd be like, yeah, but I don't agree with that. Or, hey, I feel like this. And it's like those things that come out of your mouth aren't healthy, but maybe it was a helpful way to deal with it because it was quicker and easier to rebuke. Um,
Yeah. But
and you have
also,
to learn.
Becky, one of the things that you guys had was the humility to listen and take input. And I think that, maybe even people who are listening to this right now, maybe they feel like you in that season where it's like, I know the right things to do, but it's really hard to do them. And having the humility to let someone into your mess, actually say, hey, this is what's going on, being honest with where you're at, that then allows someone to be able to come in and start speaking into your life. Where if we just almost try and hide from that, things don't change. And so I think that even like the progression of your story, where before you bolted, this time you stayed and
Yeah.
you were able to work things out and move forward. So Becky, fast forward a few years later and you've been in the
Yeah.
church and you're growing and you get
Yeah.
married, um, and you guys have got 2 kids now, which is amazing. And so it's Oakley and Nova.
Nova. Yeah. Oakley
Nova.
is 5.5, and Nova is 1.5. Yeah.
Awesome. Okay. And so uh you then have this call. You're there, I think, in at the cave at 2014, and we're building up to the cave right now.
Yeah.
So we're really excited about what God's going to do for the cave in 2024. But this was 10 years ago in 2014,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
you guys were there attending. And did you feel a sense of calling there at that cave, or did it come later?
I actually think it was there before because
Right.
so even like, we were quite excited. We were lucky that we were there at the beginning of Freedom's journey and that they'd done Uganda. Bruges was happening, but you could see there was like this travel bug. Like people were,
Yeah. People
and
wanted
we
to
were like,
plan for it.
that's so, yeah, that we were like, that's so cool. Greg and I, we love the crazy. So we were like, oh, that would be really cool. So we always said, like, one day we'd love to go abroad and do something for church. That would be really cool. So that had been there for a while. Um, but when that cave came up, we were like double hands in the air. We were like, yeah, we're so ready for like an adventure. I think that was the big sense. It was like, come on, let's go do the God adventure. Like we just really wanted to go do it and like see it firsthand and experience. And I think also we had a lot of history in Cardiff. Like we're both from Dorset. We both had a lot of history there as non-Christians. We had a history in London and Cardiff of being a non-Christian. It almost felt like if we could go somewhere else, like we could have this crazy fresh start. So there was also that side of it as well of like, why not? Let's press the reset and just do the crazy. Um, so when the call came, we were like, yeah, why not? Like it wasn't a big emotional for us. We were like, when can we go? Here's our passports. Where?
There was
But we also,
willingness in you, wasn't there? It's just like we're willing. We're just, hey God, we're signing up for the mission here. Even Greg, he's a soldier, and it's like, hey, sign me up. That was so cool. But then I think you moved, and it was almost a different reality, wasn't it? To almost the idea and the adventure. So when you then move countries, you start life again in Rotterdam. You guys are getting jobs in, a country with, a
yeah.
foreign language. What was that like for you guys? How were those first few years?
Well, I think yeah, when you first get to a new country, like what's really funny is we came over, Greg dropped all the stuff off and we'd hired a van and left our car. So the plan was, right, Becky, you unpack, I'm going to go get the dog, drop the van off, and I'll come back. And I was like, great plan. I was like, I can unpack. But as soon as he drove off, I was like, flip, I've just been left in like a foreign country by myself. Like it hadn't even crossed my mind that would be like overwhelming. So he drives off and I'm suddenly in this apartment. And then I was like, okay, well, I need to get food. And it's like, I have to go out this house and go, go find food in a foreign language by myself. And so I think the first part of moving here just makes you brave. And like, if there's one thing I could give anyone advice is number one, like choose that it's a privilege to be in the country you're in. You choose that. Like they don't welcome you with open arms, and that's not that they're unkind, unwelcoming people. I'm pretty sure that would be anywhere you go, just in the sense that, you know, it's a privilege that we're called to go be part of another nation and
Right.
another kind of people. So you have to kind of get over that almost entitlement of like, where's my flags and my banner? You know, why are you not helping me? So it's, and you have to get brave of like, okay, well, I might not know where this metro goes, but there's going to be a good adventure, or, well, we haven't got any money for this month, but it's gonna it's gonna be a good adventure. And so for the first month, we could only afford one bike, so it would be like a choice of who's gonna run, who's gonna bike. So, and we just
No way.
alternated.
Oh my gosh. Wow.
And but all of those things, like also you have to choose the fun in them. You have to. I think like we were obviously part of a big team and everybody goes through ebbs and flows. And the days that it got to people, I think, were the days where you were like, it's so different. I can't do this. Like those tired days come. And so I think the best thing you can do on those days is get up and go on another adventure. But the reality is it's stretching, it's scary, and it's expensive. um, like those are the realities. But what you gain is insane. Like I feel like, you know, I've got this whole other country in me now that I would have never have even, maybe I'd have visited it again, come and seen the tulips, but you get something else when you move somewhere and when
Yeah,
you
for sure.
immerse. So we came and we got stuck in with the church, had an amazing year. And I say had an amazing year. We had also had a journey to that point also to try and conceive. Greg and I got married and there was complications. We couldn't get pregnant. And we actually in that first year conceived and lost our first baby, and that sort of culminated all in that first year. You know, the end of the year came and a lot of the team had signed up for a year, so a lot of the team were going back. And it was at that point that we were on the fence of like, okay, what's our next move, because we'd never really discussed how long we were there. We just came, we hadn't had that conversation. And looking back, we were the only ones that moved all of our stuff. We didn't have much, but we just chucked it in a van and brought it. So it was like, oh, well, maybe we're not going back. I don't know where we'd go back to. And we actually went to Barcelona just for like a long weekend to kind of recover just from that. We were just trying to make sense of it all. And I remember standing and looking at the view of Barcelona and being like, this is a cool city. And I just said to Greg, it's not our city. And he was like, we have to go back. And it was just this strong sense of like, I love this city, but it's not ours. And Rotterdam is ours. And we know what has to happen. We just knew, like, we had the picture and we hadn't seen it. And so we came back. And again, through a long journey, we ended up taking on the leadership of the church that year. And what's incredible is we birthed God's vision, He birthed ours. And we actually, the day we moved into our building in the city centre, I went into labour with our son.
Oh,
So
wow.
God was
That
so
is quite
faithful.
amazing.
Yeah.
That is a
So,
beautiful thing. And what a victory as well to have little Oakley arrive
yeah.
and all that that meant and that answer to prayer. It's so cool. Um, Becky, with obviously pastoring the church over these last few years, I know that was hugely stretching. You know, it's like when we're talking about, your journey, there's not really a big section here of training. It was a lot of learning on the job, wasn't it? And I
Yeah.
think that, you guys have just done amazingly well to grow and adapt and learn on the go. But if you were giving us a few of your highlights of what it's meant to pastor and church plant over these years in Rotterdam, what have been some of your highlights or takeaways? What's made you go, this is worth it? this is why I'm giving my life to this?
Oh, there are so many. Just the people. Like I could tell you the name of every single person in our church and every story. Um, yeah, where do I start? It's I think first of all moving into the city centre and particularly moving into Annabelle was definitely like a flagship, like a flag day because it was we
Annabelle's a
had
nightclub, is that right?
Annabelle's nightclub, yeah. And we went to look at that nightclub actually when we very first got here when we were looking for a venue and we couldn't have it because another church had it. So another church were using it at the time. And they actually said, and you won't be able to afford it. And we were like, oh, okay. So we then moved just outside the city centre to another great location in Schiedam. But when Greg and I took on leading the church, we really felt no, I needed to be back in the centre. So we were over the road from Annabelle in a little salsa club, which again was an amazing location for the season. But it was always over the road from Annabelle. It was like there, that. So when the cave came, we rented it for the cave after lockdown because we needed space. And their church had moved out, and they wanted a church. They'd loved having a church so much that they wanted another church. And so
Wow.
I think that day that we walked in, it was like, hey, no, now we're here, we've arrived. So that was a really big like day. But like the reason for that was also some of the people that walked in that day. It was like as we made space, they came in. There was a girl called Lucy. She like just springs to my mind, and she was a teacher. Met one of our incredible South African couples. And was invited to the cave. She came for the first time to the cave, and she was a Christian, and she was really like, I mean, it was overwhelming for her, but also I was like, I'm not sure this is her thing. She was like struggling a little bit, but she kept coming and kept coming, and she always remained on the fringe. And we had the opportunity at some point when she responded to walk a journey with her pastorally, and we prayed some things off her, and we've seen the freedom in her, and she's just a different woman. She's just
Yeah, you see the
free. She's full of
transformation.
joy. She then met her fiance,
Wow.
Christoph from Namibia, in our church. And as a statement of that building, because she walked in for the first service there, they met in that building. They're getting married in Annabelle in July. And so just that full circle picture to see this
Married in the
incredible
nightclub.
couple.
Let's go.
And the church are going crazy. They're literally going to transform this place. But again,
Oh,
just that journey of the building and to see what it was all
yeah.
for, this wonderful family. Yeah, I think just all of those stories where we get to
Yeah, and there's
have
lots of
this.
them, like you say. We could go on and on about the different names and the stories, but it's just one example of God's goodness and grace through it. And you're right, that's such an amazing fruit of what this time has been about. But what do you think has been one of the biggest stretches of like that's made it hard to be there, or hard to endure? Because I think that there is something, isn't there, of being a pastor and being a leader where, and as
Yeah.
church planter in another country, you've got to endure. What do you think has been the biggest stretch in that?
I think on a practical level, language has been a real battle for us. Just like we do speak Dutch like to a level, but there's a different level. And actually, to be honest, Rotterdam particularly isn't Dutch. It's very international. But
Yeah,
I think being away from what you know and it, like being so different, and then being another language can be challenging. The fact that we work, both of us work. Like part time. Well, Greg was working full time. He's just moved to part time now. But the fact that we both work, we both love our work. We're both very blessed that we do jobs that we really enjoy and actually really fuel us and the kingdom. But I think that juggle of leading church, of working, and the family is always challenging, and also the extended family. So just we're not. I wouldn't. It's not that I don't love my family. If my family are listening to this, I love you lots. But they're very open. But they're very open with us being away. But that is always a stretch, and you'll understand this, Josh. I think it's like you sometimes want to take that break or that trip, but it is the throw up between that and sometimes seeing family. So it's all those things. It's like the practical, the language, the ways here, and the kind of earning here. Um, the emotional, that kind of like emotional family pull. And then on a spiritual level, I think if we're talking about challenge, it's it's a religious place in two different ways. So it's not religious in a sense of just being very kind of straight church, or we call it Bible Belt church here, very very old fashioned church.
Yeah.
It's not that that's the challenge. It's that there are a lot of kinds of church in people's life. Um, so here the slogan in Rotterdam is like make it happen, kind of anything goes. We're very open, but they're also not. They're also going to assume something of that. So I think sometimes some of those conversations, particularly around like work life balance, that church could in any way impact that, almost makes it like, hey,
Yeah, sure.
you're
And
sure? Yeah,
you mentioned there about work, and I don't know
yeah,
how many jobs you've had since you moved to Rotterdam. Uh,
yeah.
we do a regular like pastors call every 2 weeks, and Becky wins the prize for the most interesting places to call from. She's done it from shops, from store cupboards, from metros, where she joins the pastor's call, and we
Mhm.
get to see Becky in all these different places. But just you gave me a little summary before we came onto the call, but just give me a what are the three things that you've just been doing, the three jobs?
Okay, so my main job is I teach fitness. So I teach fitness. Pilates is kind of my bag, but I really love spinning and hit, so I do a little bit of that as well.
Okay,
Um, and they complement each other. I kind of get my good stretch and I get my hit as well. I don't teach weights. I'm not a weights person. Like
okay,
that body pump. That's not my world. I walk through the gym to the group classes, but I do that. And then I also partly work for the church as well, obviously, but that's just our life given. But the other part is I teach in international schools as well. So that's kind of a little bit ad hoc. So it depends what the schools
it's
need, but
doing
sometimes
drama,
it's
isn't it?
Shakespeare. Yeah,
Mm,
theatre or English speaking, like publicly for confidence and that kind of
wow,
thing. And so that's really cool. They're cool environments to go into. It gives me a snapshot of youth in my
yeah.
city, and
It's
yeah.
amazing. And I think that you've got such a mix of things that you're doing. You're doing those, going from classes to schools to church work to being a mum, being a wife to leading. It's quite an amazing thing. And you've got an incredible capacity, Becky, to do all these things. Um, and just as we close and we'll finish
Yeah,
this up,
yeah, yeah.
I wanted to just ask you, when you are having those moments of like, I feel far from home, this is tough. What is it that gets you picking yourself up again, or starting to say, no, this is why I'm here? Or what is it for
Oh,
you?
that's a really good question. That's a hard one to finish on. Um, I think it's important to acknowledge that that it doesn't always work. That life doesn't always work beautifully. And yes, I have a high capacity, and yes, we've done a lot of things to make it happen here. It doesn't mean you should, and it doesn't mean you should live at that level. And
Yeah,
so actually I just want to add, we are actually moving into a season where I'm going to be pulling back from some of that to make space for God.
that's
And
awesome.
so there are seasons, but when things do feel like, oh my goodness, can we do this? Or like sometimes you just think, I just want a cup of tea and to speak English. I think number one is the people you have around you is so important. Um, my
Yeah,
husband is my biggest cheerleader, and I really couldn't do it without him on the days where I'm like, oh, he just often doesn't say anything and just makes me a cup of tea and smiles in his quiet way. And I know that's his way of saying, go watch, Escape to the Country and drink a cup of tea. It'll be okay. It's my medicine, like a cottage. Um, but yeah, so like know those moments where just don't, like, if you can't deal with it, don't deal with it. Some days, don't have
yeah.
that often in your mind. But we have this saying, particularly in the spin class, I would say, no matter what, you get back up. No matter what, you get off that seat. And I just always have a little chuckle to myself and think, well, if on those days where I don't want to ride a spin bike, I can get back on the bike and do it again, then the same picture is in my life. And I can hear God almost going, no matter what, we get back up, no matter what. Come on. Yeah.
Come on, Becky. You're a hero. And thank you so much for sharing some of your story today. It's been inspiring, encouraging. And I hope those listening to this, wherever you are, that you've been able to take some things from this story. Thanks so much, Becky, and we'll be back soon with another episode on the Freedom Podcast.
Thank you.